Rosenberg is a theologian holding the Sisters of St. Joseph Chair of Catholic Thought at Fontbonne University. In this talk titled The Primacy of Desire and the Dramatic Artistry of Living, Reflections on Culture in an Age of Global Consumerism, he ties together the work of several disparate thinkers, addressing the struggle of the average contemporary person to stay engaged with her local community.
I suppose that I've just been kind of navigating and thinking through this global, local question. This kind of conference in your class really brings that tension to the fore. I don't claim to have any easy answers. I don't know if anybody does. But I'll give you some ways that I've been thinking through the question, and preface it by thinking, having this image of Charles Taylor's image of the social imaginary, and this idea that we often imagine our social existence and how we fit together, and this often happens in images and in stories and legends made possible by common practices. And I wanted to suggest that in many ways the modern social imaginary is also a kind of global imaginary. And I imagine those are some of the things that you're thinking about in this class, that there's a growing consciousness of belonging to a global community. There's a kind of a new cosmopolitan sort of movement. If we have local movements, we also have reemerged in this image of a cosmopolitan person, somebody worried about, a citizen of the world, global leadership, these kinds of things we throw around universities a lot, preparing global leaders, those kinds of things. Caritas in Veritate, one of the questions I'm intrigued by in the document is, and it's something that Julie mentioned as well, probably the primary question that I'm intrigued by and trying to think through is the document's invitation to a serious review of lifestyle, which in many parts of the world it suggests is prone to hedonism and consumerism. So when Greg and Julie was touching on this as well, talking about capitalism and which capitalism and so forth, I suppose what's on my mind is the kind of global consumerism, that element. So I'm not at all out to put a kibosh on capitalism, on the creativity of free enterprise and things like that. But I worried about global consumerism, where many of our identities are shaped by the images that we're given in a pretty hyper consumerist society. And I think about this often even with my young kids. This comes to the fore quite often. How do they understand themselves? What kinds of images and stories are informing their self-identity? And it has a lot to do with Katy Perry and Taylor Swift and other people like that. So anyway, those sort of existentially on my mind as well. So the document invites a serious review of lifestyle, and you may remember, in which the quest for truth, beauty, goodness, and communion predominate. I think it's quite an amazing invitation to think through in our society, how do we nurture that kind of review of lifestyle. The document prioritizes relationality, gift, the kinds of things we've been thinking about already today as well. And how do we think about gratuity and communion, both in our micro relationships, family, local community, and how also do we then how do those translate more globally, more widely? Again, themes that have touched upon. So those are some things that I find real challenges in Caritas in Veritate. One thing that, just in terms of that tension between the micro relationships and sort of that we belong to this much larger world, I found David Schindler's comment, and it's on the second page of your notes on the top. Interesting. It invites a lot of analysis, but he has an article, and I think I mentioned this last year, so those who are, not that you remember everything, but sorry if it feels repetitive at times. David Schindler says what he wishes to, so he's talking about homelessness in the modern condition. In this article, he's not talking about homelessness, literal homelessness, but more alienation that people feel, sort of rootlessness. And he says, what I wish to suggest in the context of, and he's trying to recover a real sense of the personal in social life, is that the purpose of our existence as consumers and as workers at the deepest level is to transform the world into a home. To extend the organic relations constitutive of the family into the structures of the world, and thereby to domesticate the world. So he's trying to help us think through, and there's a much larger quote that I could give from the article, but you can see the article for more passages related to that. So the question of consumerism, and what I want to think through in this presentation is first give you a snapshot of one thinker, William Cavanaugh, how he's thought through a little bit of this in terms of desire and a global consumerist era, and then I want to make some modest contribution to the question and think through the human person as dramatic, all right, not as just a consumer, where things are emptied into ourselves and we want. You know, I get this with my kids a lot. I want, I need. You know, they sort of wake up that way. And I start singing I have an I want, I need song that I start singing to them. And then they just sort of laugh and realize that their fundamental mode of being, and I know they're young, it has been purely give me, I want, I need. So, but I want to think through more deeply. Because sometimes I'll say to Luke, my older one, who's 8, it's not all about what you want, you know. You're part of the drama of this family. You can contribute something as well. You know, you need to do that. You take this out or go, you know, maybe you can help me empty the dishwasher for a minute or go downstairs and carry up the laundry basket. But really, more seriously, I guess partly just what I want to do today is rethink a kind of anthropology, rethink the human being in terms of being part of the drama of existence. Okay, so William Cavanaugh talks about globalization as an aesthetics. All right, globalization obviously a very complicated topic, but he's referring to this in terms of as a kind of aesthetics, as a way of looking at the world that is produced by and produces certain kinds of desires. Okay, so he goes in and he talks about globalization as the triumph of the universal. All right, so he talks about new modes or new models of production, moving from a Fordist to a post-Fordist economy, so kind of a factory and a town revolving around a factory, to a more complex kind of economy. So he treats the theme of transnational corporations and culture, and he talks about what ends up emerging in a global consumerist era, at least in the West, is this vision of one world of homogeneous consumption. All right? So we can get the same food, the same hotels, the same music, and so forth. This is exhibited by the president of Nabisco, who had this aspiration, and I quote, "I'm looking forward to the day when Arabs and Americans, Latins and Scandinavians will be munching Ritz crackers as enthusiastically as they already drink Coke or brush their teeth with Colgate." All right? So we have global cultural flows that are generated, I think, as we know, I mean, in large part by global media empires. So it's just a reality to pay attention to. So he sees this kind of homogeneous or universalizing trend in that regard. Okay? But then he plays with this sort of universal and the particular. You know, one of these themes I think Greg was mentioning earlier, this universal and particular tension, which you find in philosophy, right? So he talks about globalization in terms of producing a lot of particulars. All right, so he refers to Benjamin Barber. You read a little bit of him in the class? Yeah. The consuming one.
Just the first 2 chapters.
Okay, of that, right. He refers here to a different one, Jihad versus McWorld, where you have fundamentalism and, you know, combating the kind of Americanization of the world, produced by the theme that's sort of McWorld, or kind of McDonald's world. What you have in also is a kind of particularization that you'll find in multicultural movements. All right, the ideal that many faiths and cultures are given space. So you get this sense of, well, isn't globalization, hasn't it made space for allowing us to appreciate diversity and appreciate particulars? Okay? 3, he talks about the bewildering variety of products for the consumer in the world. So he talks about the McDonaldization of society. All right, that in an economy that isn't forwardist to sort of that factory model, the key is to create a bunch of new kinds of desires. All right, so McDonald's has to keep reinventing its products with a little bit different twist on it, and to create a new desire for this new kind of product. And some of these places, like Hardee's, you start adding like a burger with not just bacon, but other kinds of meat. So you start mishmashing all these kinds of sandwiches, creating as that, wow, I didn't know you could get 4 kinds of meat on one sandwich. All right, so it's this sort of creating new desires, like, oh yeah, that's what I need. So Cavanaugh is worried about these kinds of things, or at least he notices this. So the question that he raised is globalization then the realization of greater universality? Okay, so creating this homogeneous world, consumption, or greater particularity. All right, it's in our environment we know much more about cultures, particularities, different kinds of faiths, different kinds of worldviews, and for him, a simple answer of yes is misleading. Okay, so for Cavanaugh, for the example of multiculturalism, for example, he applauds the intention, or certainly he's not out to say we shouldn't appreciate people who are different faith traditions, but he's worried that it creates a kind of, you might say, really post-cultural movement, that it subjects every culture to kind of individual choice. So you start kind of picking and choosing elements of different cultures as well. So he quotes the phrase that the 20th century in America is a graveyard of cultures. He talks about the dynamic of consuming and producing. All right, so in a mass supermarket culture, we must be now, when everything starts seeming the same, again, we want to create some kind of difference or novelty. So he refers to one of the beer companies. There's been a great emphasis recently on craft brews, not homebrew, but sort of more local brews, and I love that. I mean, St. Louis is a haven for a lot of these places now, which is wonderful. But then now you have bigger beer corporations creating sort of local flavors, or creating an appeal to, as if they're offering a kind of a local product or an exotic product as well. I was thinking of what was the Miller 54? Do you remember that commercial? 64, yeah, sorry, Miller 64 calories, not 54. But I remember even the commercial was sort of emulating, like as if you're in a kind of like an Irish pub or something like that, singing songs, but they're doing this with Miller 64. But there was a sense of appealing to the difference. So really what Cavanaugh is emphasizing, that, and he's using this phrase, postmodernism as the cultural logic of late capitalism, and that's a Jameson phrase, Jameson book. But the idea is that in a hyper-consumerist economy, that there's emphasis on surface image, okay? Exchange value overcomes use value. No longer are you marketing a product for its own goodness or its own sake, but you're sort of, we know all this, right? Branding certain images with the product. So you look at commercials and you think, what did that really have to do with Bud Light? Or, you know this stuff, or soap or shampoo, right? So what happens is they're marketing a certain image, a certain feeling, a certain mood, appealing to human desire in many ways, okay? So what's Cavanaugh's... So he poses the challenge, instead of the consumer, rather than being part of a larger drama, all right, the consumer empties things into the self. All right, so some of his solutions have to do with, he wants to avoid, I guess, labels or easy sort of concepts. So, for example, he says, and I say this on the notes, the aim is not to embrace or replace abstractions with other abstractions, capitalism, localism, globalism. Rather, the aim is to sustain forms of economy, community, and culture that recognize the universality of the person, the dignity of the human person, and so forth. So he recommends a couple practices. One, I think Julie was talking about fair trade, this kind of thing where sort of alternative forms of consumption that try to bridge the gap between the producer and the consumer. He talks about church-supported agriculture, all right, where it enables face-to-face encounters with the producer and then the consumer, the parishioner and the farmer. Again, trying to create a sense of the prioritizing the personal in the whole enterprise. So I use Cavanaugh as a kind of a foray into a lot of issues. He probably raises more questions than certainly that I'm able to answer here. But I think what he's inviting us to do, and there's been variations of this theme already today, is to rethink the human person, all right, beyond just a consumer. So one of the things that I want to suggest is one way of thinking about the human person is as a dramatic subject, all right, as part of a drama. So using a kind of metaphor of drama, and it relates in many ways, I think, to the relationality, the gift-like character of being in the world that Caritas and Veritate was speaking to. All right? So the dramatic metaphor presents an alternative to a consumerist or egoist understanding of human desire. Instead of a consumer emptying all of things into the self, a dramatic understanding of the human person, of the human situation, situates the human person in service to and in the context of a larger drama. All right, so I want to suggest right away one connection I make in my mind then is to think about the term vocation in some ways, to think about being in the world or our forms of life and the drama of human existence as a kind of call to serve. All right, it's mentioned in Caritas and Veritate, where they speak of a human vocation to foster human development. Wendell Berry, who I know you've read, he's been referred to today, suggests that the many costs of the total economy, the loss of the principle of vocation, is probably the most symptomatic, and from a cultural standpoint, the most critical. Or to put it in other terms, if you've ever read Viktor Frankl, and if you've ever had to read Man's Search for Meaning, he was a Holocaust survivor. But he says this. He says, one should not search for an abstract meaning of life. So oftentimes he thinks about that people think, well, the meaning of my life is just to kind of search for meaning, and so it's about my search. And I don't know. I would think I don't want to obviously down that idea of the human, part of the richness of being human is the quest for meaning. I think that's true. But he sort of turns the tables on us a little bit, and he wants to think about it in a different way. He says, everyone has his or her own specific vocation or mission in life to carry out a concrete assignment which demands fulfillment. Therein he cannot be replaced, nor can his life be repeated. Thus, everyone's task is unique as his specific opportunity to implement it. And recall, I mean, he's really getting these insights when he's in a concentration camp, and he's analyzing human behavior in a camp. So at least his words bear a certain gravity, I think, to think about. And as each situation in life represents a challenge to man and presents a problem for him to solve, the question of the meaning of a life may actually be reversed. Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. So I highlight that passage just to begin thinking of the human person in terms of a kind of accountability to a larger drama. Okay, I want to share a couple. One theme from the philosopher Bernard Lonergan. And Lonergan talks about different patterns in human experience. Many people, if you've ever read him, they think about him in terms of the intellectual pattern. He wrote a book called Insight. It's like 800 pages. But in his work, he differentiates different patterns of experience we have. So the intellectual pattern is one. The biological pattern is another, all right, that we're all embodied. And we have sort of biological patterns of experience. You might experience it now again after lunch. You get tired as well. And it would have nothing to do with the presentation at hand. It's the body. But he talks about the aesthetic pattern, the experience of beauty. And then another pattern is the dramatic pattern. And he suggests that we fundamentally live in the dramatic pattern. I mean, we're involved in a bunch of social roles, okay? We live in families and communities, and that's where we primarily reside. So for him, the dramatic pattern of experience illuminates the fact that our first work of art is our own living. All right, so to begin to think about the human life as a dramatic work of art. Greg mentioned earlier, he had the challenge of let's think about this in more artful terms. And it struck me that there's a connection there. So for him, the deepest desires of human living, focusing on living a life that is meaningful and dignified. People don't live in order to develop technologies, economies, and polities, but they work hard at developing and improving these in order that their lives may be richer, fuller, more complete. Above practicality, there's the comprehensive artistry of one's performance in the drama of living, where the goal is not just to satisfy the needs and desires, but to do so admirably, appealingly, beautifully, with a sense of dramatic accomplishment. And I think some themes that relate here are thinking about the human being, again, not as just I want, but the human person in the drama of existence is at his or her best, I think, when we're creative, that when we exercise creativity and cultivation and even contemplation. Dr. Charon, I was hitting on some of the themes last year, and he may not remember this, but it hit home to me because it's a theme I cared about, but it's something I didn't include in the reflections. And you had asked about, you talk about all this sort of doing and performing, but what about silence in modern living, and especially, and so I began here with sort of the contemplative part of life. And I want to share a quote from a guy named Andy Crouch, who I just reading James Davison Hunter's book, which is, what's it called again? To Change the World. He refers and critiques this Crouch character. So I went, after reading James Davison Hunter, I went to Andy Crouch. And he hits on these themes. He talks about the human capacity really to create culture, all right, and to create horizons of possibility. And that goes to the heart of some of what it means to live in a rich way. But Crouch says this, and here, I mean, just some context, he's critiquing his own way of looking at culture, and he's trying to identify what was missing, because all he did was look suspiciously on everything he was suggesting. So he says this: what was missing was two postures: creativity and cultivation. Or, he says, creativity, the posture of the artist, creativity. Cultivation, the posture of a gardener. So those are two images there. All right, so the artist and the gardener. The postures of an artist and the gardener have a lot in common, but both begin with contemplation, okay? Paying close attention to what is already there. The gardener looks carefully at the landscape, the existing plants, both flowers and weeds, the way the sun falls on the land. The artist regards her subject, her canvas, her paints with care to discern what she can make with them. And then, after contemplation, the artist and the gardener both adopt a posture of purposeful work. They bring their creativity and effort to their calling. The gardener tends what has gone before, making the most of what is beautiful and weeding out what is distracting or useless. The artist can be more daring, Crouch suggests. She starts with a blank canvas or a solid piece of stone and gradually brings something out of it that was never there before. Instead of condemners or copiers, he's talking about different postures toward culture. Why aren't we known as cultivators, he asked, people who tend and nourish what is best in human culture, who do the hard and painstaking work to preserve the best of what people have before us have done? Why aren't we known as creators, he asked, people who dare to think and to do something that has never been thought or done before, something that makes the world more welcoming and thrilling and beautiful. So in light of this dramatic vision or dramatic picture of human beings, I want to, really the last part of my presentation, I want to think through this question of desire within the human drama. And by highlighting them, I suppose we could talk about desires in many ways, so I'm just trying to think through this. And I want to highlight two ways that I think are relevant to rethinking the human person in the human drama. All right? One would be mimetic desire, and I'll say something about that, and two would be the desire to know. All right? So the primacy of desire, to get to the topic of the article, or of my presentation. There's no article, I promise. I'm not that. I don't have everything organized mentally to do that yet. The primacy of desire. I started thinking more intentionally about this when I read a book by a guy named James K.A. Smith. He wrote a book called Desiring the Kingdom. He's out of Calvin College, so he comes from the Calvinist tradition. And it's an interesting book because he argues this in the book. And I'll just give you the quote that on page 5 of the notes. Because I think that we are primarily desiring animals rather than thinking things. Right? I would say right away, he gives a caveat in the book saying, I'm not against knowledge, I'm not anti-knowledge, I'm not anti-reason, but he's suggesting that we often fail to think about what is at the root of knowledge, which is desire, okay, the desire to know. Or at least, I want to add that. I don't think he brings that out as clearly, the desire to know, but desire. Okay? So here's Smith again. Because I think that we are primarily desiring animals rather than merely thinking things, I also think that what constitutes our identities, what makes us who we are, the kind of people we are, is what we love. More specifically, our identity is shaped by what we ultimately love or what we love as ultimate. What at the end of the day gives us a sense of meaning, purpose, understanding, and orientation to our being in the world. All right, so he hones really in on this idea of our fundamental way of being in the world is the way of desire. And the book, he's really trying to engage culture in the book. So he's trying to suggest that we often, at least in our way of being in the world, that we kind of know from the bottom up, from our bodies up, from paying attention to the yearning of the human spirit. So he talks about a lot of the things that go on in our culture as cultural liturgies. All right, I don't know if unless you come from a Catholic tradition or the Anglican tradition or the Orthodox, I don't know if you refer to church services as liturgy in your traditions, but he's playing off this term. So in the book, he has a whole interpretation of what goes on at a shopping mall, for example, that we pull up, and often times we're at big malls, you can be escorted on carts. You're escorted by the acolyte into the mall, and then you walk around, and you have icons and images of what human flourishing look like. So he's alluding to icons of saints or pictures of saints. You go in, you're guided by the person in the store. You're given the idea of what the good life is all about. And he suggests that people who sort of orchestrate a kind of mall experience, and he does this with sports, by the way. He does this with military things. Though it's an interesting book because he raises the stake what's going on in our cultural activities. And we often think of them as neutral or not that meaningful. He claims that they understand how being in the world is like, what it means to be. They appeal to our desires. They appeal to our bodies. And so he thinks often Christian education tries to appeal to this kind of worldview idea. And he thinks that they should appeal more to human desire. Okay, so that's a much larger argument. But the desiring model of the human person begins from our nature as intentional beings, that our fundamental mode of intentional consciousness is sort of care that we know within a horizon. We know there's this, we don't know as sort of purely abstract sort of thinking things, all right, that we're embodied people in the world with certain concerns and cares that drive our desire to know. Okay, so enough on that. So the primacy of desire. So I want to suggest then two modes of desire worth thinking about in the context of this question of global consumerism. One would be mimetic desire. I don't think you had any readings by René Girard. He's still living from France, part of the French Academy, but he's been teaching at Stanford for many years. And for one of Girard's insights, he does a lot of work on like scapegoating mechanisms in cultures, and the way the scapegoating mechanisms are, infiltrate culture, how they're overcome, the rest. But one of his contributions is mimetic desire. Mimetic meaning kind of imitative. All right? So Girard says this: to say that our desires are imitative or mimetic is to root them neither in objects nor in ourselves, but in a third party, the model or the mediator, whose desire we imitate in the hope of resembling him or her. All right? So for Girard, I mean, think about it in this way. This happens if you're ever around a bunch of 2-year-olds. One 2-year-old could be playing with a toy, and another 2-year-old playing with another toy. But what happens when the one 2-year-old spots the other 2-year-old with the toy? I want that toy. Why? Because that other person has it. All right? So the desire isn't rooted in, wow, that toy is objectively good in itself. So what Girard begins to get us to think about is, how our desires are mediated. Why do we desire what we desire? It's a pretty interesting question. I've heard an interview with Girard, actually. You can hear an interview on iTunes University through Stanford. And he was saying, do you think, girls wake up he was talking about the Britney Spears phenomenon a few years ago. But do girls, for example, wake up in the morning and say, I want to wear that midriff? Or, I want that particular style? All right? Do we just wake up and say, oh, I desire that? No, why do we desire things? All right, because we want to desire what that other person desires. All right, this happens. If you're a soccer fan, you know that the English Premier League is coming to St. Louis. So Chelsea's coming. They're going to play Manchester City. It's a big deal. But it got me thinking about. So I got some tickets. Pretty penny, chance of a lifetime. I guess I keep telling myself. So, there's whole things to get these tickets before they sold out in like 20 minutes. So the reason is because my son Luke, who actually is playing a soccer game right now, my dad was supposed to send me the final score. It was 2-1 right when the talk started. So if you saw me over here, I was like, give me the update. He said final 2-1, which is good news. But I started thinking about, and he's an 8-year-old kid, and he's not, I'm not saying he's Pele or anything like that, but it's interesting for parents to watch their kids sort of emerge into a skill, and wow, how did that happen? Pretty good. And parents in the room have seen their own children maybe. Those of you, your parents have seen you. Like, wow, how did they end up at Lindenwood in this beautiful room talking about big ideas for all weekend? I mean, how impressive. I mean, it is impressive. In many ways. Well, how did Luke, first of all, begin to love Chelsea? He didn't wake up one morning and say, God, I love Chelsea. He doesn't even never been to England. All right, well, our next door neighbor, who's in 8th grade now, loved Chelsea. All right, he's also a good soccer player. So over the last few years, how did Luke in many ways emerge into a pretty good little player? Justin, the neighbor. He saw Justin, he desired what Justin desired, both in terms of skill, but also in terms of dress and look. I ended up buying a Chelsea shirt, and I wonder why I bought that shirt. What is it in that whole? But it's interesting to think about how our desires operate. And Julie was talking about, I made some connection earlier she was talking about that a lot of times our thinking and our solutions but we have to think about ourselves as situated in communities involved in certain kinds of practices. And that's what mimetic desire gets at, that our desires are often socially mediated. Okay? But the thing that Girard wants to point out, or at least that I want to suggest, and I don't know if Girard goes this far, because in a way he says all desire is mimetic. But I think what happens is, what I say here, I don't know if I can find it on the notes, but I'll just summarize it for you, that it's within a mimetic. So think about even your desire to be scholars here. Like in a way, you're fueled by a love for truth, but at least for me, I was fascinated by love for truth, but I was also fascinated by my professors, or even earlier than that, the high school teachers, for example. I mean, in many ways, I didn't know what they were talking about, but I wanted to love what they loved. Like I wanted to be able to talk like them, or care about like what they cared about in many ways. So, but I think what can happen is that this pursuit of truth, this desire to know that I want to hit at next, the other way of the other kind of desire, I think is fostered, instigated, the conditions are created for desiring to know the truth and desiring goodness by those kinds of models that we were surrounded by, privileged enough to be surrounded by. Or think about the models that maybe it wasn't so good that we were surrounded by them. All right? So so I guess what I want to get at is it's something to think about in an era of global consumerism when we have all kinds of competing images of what the good life is, all right, and what human flourishing is all about. All right? So so much of the consumer cultures is pushed by sort of this imitation of desire. All right? So it raises the question for all of us to think about is, where do we place our stock? Who is our model of desire? Our models of desire, and so forth. But the ones that I was so moved by as in high school and in college are wanting to desire what, for example, those professors desired. And so it has been my experience with education anyway, is that they influenced me to not only kind of imitate them in some ways, but to do what they were doing, which was to pursue the truth, all right, in my own way. So not a kind of blind imitation, but being influenced by that, but then dealing with my own challenge at my own particular time in life, with my own particular skills, and so forth, to pursue the truth. All right, which leads me to the second kind of desire. Well, let me make sure I hit all the points. So mimetic desire, you get that idea. And so forth. And James K. Smith, that book I talked about, hits upon so much of what we're communicated, or what is communicated to us. Our vision of the good life appeals to us, even in image and story and legend and symbol and the rest. Okay, so the second kind of desire, the desire to know. All right? Let's see. There we go. But I can't leave without mentioning St. Ignatius. The new pope is a Jesuit. And we have some St. Louis U people here, this Jesuit crowd. I was thinking about, when I think about mimesis or mimetic desire, I was thinking about St. Ignatius. I don't know if you know his story. But he was wounded in battle, and he was laying on his sick bed, and he was reading basically novels of I don't know, not romance novels, but legend and novels of chivalry and the rest, which is not bad, but he ran out of books, and then he started reading the lives of the saints. And that's really what led to a kind of conversion, reading the lives of the saints. So, but he asked the question in his autobiography. He began to ask questions like this: what if I should do what Francis did? St. Francis did. St. Francis of Assisi, he's talking about, who the current pope named himself after. And what St. Dominic did. He continues, St. Dominic did this, therefore I have to do it. St. Francis did this, therefore I have to do it. So there's a real mimetic quality, I think, to a story like Ignatius. Okay, so kind of second and lastly, the other desire that I think worth reflecting on is this fundamental desire to know. And I guess one of the main things I wanted to point out is that knowledge is what Bernard Lonergan, for example, talks about it as the eros of the human mind. It's an erotic drive. It's a yearning. Okay? So in the notes here, I distinguish between common sense knowing and theoretical, historical knowing. But I'll move to the second. Well, the common sense knowing would be, I mean, none of these they're both legitimate forms of knowing. Common sense knowing often we attribute to being able to do concrete tasks, solving problems. There's not much interest in sort of historical, theoretical questions, but for example, how to cook a fish, or how to catch a fish, and then cook it. You got to catch it first before you cook it. All right? So kind of practical. My grandpa, when I think about him, was brilliant in this kind of knowing, which isn't necessarily my kind of knowing. But he used to show me how to fix my car, and how to make wooden trash cans, and really practically oriented. But another kind of knowing is this disinterested desire to know. And it doesn't mean you're not interested. It means it's pure. It's questions. You're able to pursue your questions. Further questions arise, and so forth. It's kind of a knowledge we associate with knowledge for the sake of knowledge, which John Henry Newman says, a university should should be about this kind of knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So it's not just how to catch and cook a fish, it's knowing why fish are the way they are, how they operate in different environments. All right, so it's asking these. So when Dr. Charon talked earlier about it, he said, I want to raise questions and put something in a historical context. This is the kind of questions that we're talking about. So, but what kinds of things block this pure desire to know, this erotic spirit that drives us to yearn and to search for the truth? I wanted to give you four different ways that Bernard Lonergan speaks about things that prevent this knowledge to take root, and then I'll end soon, I promise. One would be what he calls a dramatic bias. And this is where our fears and feelings block our desire to pursue further questions. All right, so we censor data out of fear of really knowing what's true and what's there. Second, he talks about individual bias, and this would be the bias of selfishness or egoism. I suppose really just what I want to say is this question of the global and the local and living in the drama of existence. Part of doing that well is to be able to continue to pursue the right questions. And these are the kinds of questions that we've heard about all morning. Okay? So egoism or individual bias is tied with selfishness, okay, with only being concerned with self-serving courses of action, not being concerned with larger questions of love and justice, and so forth. Okay, so for example, in terms of economic questions, I have some questions that Robert Reich, for example, on the notes on page 8, ask. And he says, often our market desires conflict with our moral commitments. As consumers, we look for the best possible deals. As moral agents, we try to do the right thing for our communities. How do we cope with that conflict? He says we often just avoid the question. All right? So it would be a kind of dramatic bias in some ways, avoiding the question in order to, because it's tough. I mean, there's only so many hours in the day, right? What if the products we buy come at the expense of our neighbors' jobs and wages? He says we usually ignore, or we assign blame to the producers, all right? The big retailers, the corporations, and not to ourselves as consumers. But our demand for great deals requires this. Or we purposely don't make the connections between our consumer choices and child labor or local job loss. And so he talks about the quest for the best deal. Right? I don't know how to navigate all those. I mean, because I often look for the right good deals. But I think part of this is becoming, yielding to the erotic desire to know, being willing to pursue the further questions. A third kind of bias would be group bias. All right, this happens within different groups, class conflict, even this sort of us and them mentality that was talked about earlier. Okay. So we have group bias for him. And then fourthly, he talks about general bias or anti-theoretical bias. All right, and this is on the top of page 9. All right, and what he's getting at is often we only concern ourselves with short-term problems, short-term solutions, whether this is making profit quickly or at the expense of others. But what this kind of bias is really for Bernard Lonergan, the way he frames it, is this, and I say in the bullet point: common sense knowers are concerned with short-term problems. Historical theoretical knowers are concerned with how and why the social order is the way it is, understanding how a long series of past common sense knowers in their respective communities have made history and handed it on in their present form. So it's often against, I guess the way of putting it is short-term versus kind of long-term, sustainable kinds of answers. So a quote from Caritas and Veritate: the problem of food insecurity needs to be addressed within a long-term perspective, eliminating the structural causes that give rise to it and promoting the agricultural development of poorer countries, for example. So there's that push in that document that you read for kind of avoiding what might be called an anti-theoretical or a general kind of bias. Okay? So I guess in sum, what I've tried to do here is talk about the challenges, I think, inherent in not just with capitalism as such, but the kinds of global consumerism that often dominate our lives and our identity. And I looked at Cavanaugh, and then I tried to say, all right, instead of thinking of ourselves as merely consumers, let's think about ourselves as dramatic and being tied with and being responsible to particular families, communities, and so forth, and to think about our lives as works of art, and being aware of then that our primary way of being in the world, and the global consumerism knows this, is as desiring animals, all right? But then to think about a couple different kinds of desire that constitute our lives: mimetic desire and the pure unrestricted desire to know. All right, thank you.